Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the virtual Kant Congress with a cosmopolitan purpose. Before we start, I would kindly ask you to switch on your cameras if possible, so that we can emulate the ambience of sharing the same room. Today we have a very special session. It is the 15th session of the Virtual Kant Congress, and it will be curated by the Kant Society in Egypt, which is carrying out today its inaugural session. So there was no Kant Society in Egypt, and thanks to this event, they have decided to organize one, and today we have this special inaugural session. So we are very happy about this, to have somehow contribute to for this to happen. So the session will be the session was put together by Edison Ellis. So thank you, Edison, for doing this. And will be moderated by Alessandro Voppa, who is professor of philosophy in the American University in Cairo. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. And after the session, we'll have informal conversations after the recording will be stopped. So you're all very welcome to stay. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Alessandro. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to it. And Alessandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to Luis, and thank you very much to Karen for the warm welcome. I hope you can hear me well. Let me introduce my colleagues, Dr. Edison Ellis, who will be giving the first talk on the temporal difference and timelessness in Kant and Heidegger, followed by Dr. Richard Fincham, who will speak about the question to what extent the inaugural dissertation is dogmatic. And finally, Dr. Abdul Majid will be talking about the ideal of God as a reflective ratio essendi and cognoscendi of aesthetic judgment, a new perspective on the relationship between aesthetic judgment, morality, and rational religion. Am I audible? Great. So that's the overview. And now let me briefly introduce the first speaker that we have, Dr. Edison Ellis. He works mainly on Kant and phenomenology. His last publication is a translation of the classic of the Spanish literature on Kant, El Problema de la Nada en Kant, by Ernesto Maes Valdenilla. And it was published as Kant and the Problem of Nothingness with Bloomsbury in spring 2024. In his work on Kant, he has been focusing on the concept of spontaneity and has recently completed papers on rational faith in Kant and the emptiness of the I. The paper he will present today, however, deals with the temporal difference and timelessness in Kant and Heidegger, so with a subject matter that allows them to exploit both his expertise in phenomenology and in Kant. The floor is yours, dear Edison.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. Let me quickly just share my slides. These slides will be quite basic. So they're intended simply to present a couple of the passages that might be relevant if people are interested in reading them as I go along. So this is an abbreviated version of some what is really still a work in progress, very abbreviated. And so I'm afraid I'll have to kind of run through some quite complicated things that really deserve more time, and hopefully, maybe in the discussion we can have more of that detail. So Kant infamously opposes to the forms of sensibility, space and time, the forms and activity of the I, its forms of judgments and its categories. In so doing, he asserts again and again that the transcendental I is not bound by any temporal condition. To anyone familiar with Heidegger, and especially his engagement with Kant, it's clear that how a problem might now arise. Heidegger, in fact, sees just this point as encapsulating his fundamental dispute with Kant's philosophy. While this has hardly gone unrecognized, what I think has received much less attention is the issue of whether Heidegger really appreciates what Kant himself could say in defense of his timelessness thesis, if we could put it that way, and more importantly, how the dispute really signifies a deeper dispute regarding how each of them differs in their approach to understanding the limits of intelligibility. So in short, I'll spell out and evaluate Heidegger's critique of Kant's timeless I, which is central to his overall criticism of Kant and following him of German idealism, and then suggest that the plausibility of the timelessness claim is largely overlooked by Heidegger because the relation between objectivity and our self-knowledge of our own limits is not placed at center stage of his evaluation. So there's two basic theses here that need to be discussed, the first of which is common to each thinker, and the second belonging to Kant alone. First, a distinction must be drawn between within timeness, we could call, with Heidegger, we can call it Innerseitigkeit, and pure or original time. This I call the temporal difference. So the difference between, for Kant, empirical time and pure time, and two, that the temporal difference requires a judgment that determines and therefore thinks beyond any conditions of time. Spelling out the plausibility of both will take up most of my time here, but I'll also discuss in some detail Heidegger's dissatisfaction with Kant's timeless I by showing how he diagnoses Kant's reasons for endorsing it. At the end, I want to briefly, if I can, get to why Kant would not accept Heidegger's diagnosis and why he would maintain that the timelessness, maintain the timelessness of the I. That's going to involve registering the difference between two kinds of timelessness, as well as how the stronger form, what I'll call atemporality, involves an explicit rejection of the idea that the I has what Heidegger would call horizontal limits. So Heidegger's critique, very briefly, we begin with here and stick mainly to his book, his Kant book, the Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, where one of the central formulations of Heidegger's critique takes the form of a discussion of the principle of contradiction. So the principle of contradiction taken by Kant is the absolutely necessary principle demanding that all thought must not be in conflict with itself. He says, as a merely logical principle, it must not limit its claims to temporal relations. He argues that it cannot be stated, for instance, in the following way: P and not P cannot be asserted at the same time. That would be an inadequate formulation. Doing so would, the principle of contradiction would refer itself to what occurs in time, and then the temporal happenings would be a measure of the logical coherence of thought. This would be a mistake, since the principle of contradiction should hold sway over the whole of time. Governing all that is possible in time, it therefore cannot be limited by time. Heidegger recognizes the conditional soundness of this point. So long as the clause limited by time means limited within time, Kant is correct. But the representation of time in terms of what happens within its sequential passage is, he says, non-original. A very classic thing for Heidegger to accuse someone of being, non-original. Even for Kant, as we will see, the empirical passage of time is enabled by an original non-empirical representation of the whole of time. And given this, to say that the ultimate constitutive principle of thought is not conditioned by occurrences within time is, of course, not straight away the same as saying that the principle is not temporal. Time is, of course, temporal, even if not in time. Come back to this idea. But Heidegger also sees this as Kant's reason for asserting the timelessness of the I. For one thing, the principle of contradiction is one of logical self-consciousness, and therefore of the logical I. The general logical criterion of truth is the agreement of a cognition no, I don't have that there. The agreement of a cognition with the general and formal laws of understanding and reason. Since general logic has to do only with the form of thinking, abstracting from any object, it concerns, quote, only the formal conditions of agreement with the understanding. This is to say that the highest logical principle concerns the way in which a thought or judgment agrees with its own capacity, the understanding. For this reason, a contradictory judgment would be nothing at all, he says, since it would be a disagreement with the understanding and itself, a self-canceling act. The sine qua non of any thought, then, is that any act of consciousness should agree with itself, which is to say, be a unity of self-consciousness. Kant therefore seems to be arguing that it is not only the principle of contradiction that is exempt from the conditions of time, but the logical I itself. And Heidegger affirms this by citing Kant's later claim that, quote, pure reason as a merely intelligible faculty is not subject to the form of time, hence not subject to the conditions of the temporal sequence. The I that is that which is one and the same inside every cognition. It's not subject to the temporal sequence and is therefore outside it in some sense. This now also causes Heidegger to read Kant as asserting the constant presence of the I, which is now itself a distinctively temporal characterization, albeit one that has capitulated to a classically dogmatic conception. So Kant's attempt to prove that the I is beyond time appears to be nothing more than an uncritical assumption that the I is eternally or constantly present, what the classical or medievals would call the nunc stans. So now coming to the Kant's notion of time and its the difference between pure or original time and empirical time. Because Kant contraposes the timeless I to temporal succession, Heidegger criticizes him for thinking of time primarily as a continuous series of present moments. And it is true that time gets presented in terms of the contrast between simultaneity and succession. The a priori necessity of time, quote, has only one dimension. Different times are not simultaneous, but successive, just as different spaces are not successive, but simultaneous. This successiveness, however, is not that of things in themselves, but rather of my inner states through an act of self-intuiting. While the notion of self-affection, which has become a big topic in Kant, involves the understanding's effect upon sensibility, Heidegger, I think, thinks of it more broadly, beginning with how Kant conceives of inner sense, time, itself as the means by which, quote, the mind intuits itself or its inner state. Such an intuition, apart from the effect of understanding upon inner sense, is conceived by Heidegger as a pure, spontaneous, receptive hybrid of affecting and simultaneously being passive to myself. Time here is nothing other than the subject's immediate consciousness of itself, as Arthur Melnick puts it, as the shifting of attention of my own passing states. Time does not now subsist for itself as a thing in itself, because it can be nothing other than the form of inner sense, that is, of the intuition of ourself and our inner state. That has a couple of important implications, one of which is that time is a consciousness of the elapsing of states. It is therefore not simply the occurrence of different states in succession, but an awareness of succession. The second implication is that time is then the form of inner sense, or, quote, merely a subjective condition of our human intuition, and the constant form of my inner intuition. This means that time is originally pure. It's not a stretch of moments or piece of sensible content, but a form of being conscious of such content. Because this form is nothing but the subject's self-intuition, it is thereby nothing outside the subject, extant or otherwise present at hand. Indeed, anything present to me presupposes its time of being present. While in this way time cannot be made intelligible as an appearance, it is never perceived, Kant says. It is commonly represented spatially in the form of a line progressing to infinity. Here too, though, time as the mere form of inner intuiting's successiveness is revealed as itself nothing successive at all. While all determinations of time are determinations of the elapsing of my inner states, Kant says that time itself does not elapse, but the existence of that which is changeable elapses in it. Thus, there is a distinction between what occurs within the order of succession, what is within time for Heidegger, and the non-elapsing form of consciousness of succession. Occurrences are successively structured, but time does not, quote unquote, occur as such. We may call this distinction the temporal difference. That is the difference between what occurs in temporal succession and the original representation of time in which it occurs. This non-elapsing of time for Kant is sometimes represented by Heidegger as the merely negative presupposition in a transcendental argument. Time is primarily the continuous now series, although these nows presuppose a non-elapsing representational ground against which they can be made intelligible. But this permanent or non-elapsing pure time also has positive functions for Kant. For one thing, it grounds the representation of the permanent in phenomena, substance. It is also the source of divisions which make up the temporal sequences of empirical time, since Kant conceives of pure time as an intuited whole that is prior to its parts. But the conscious representation of pure time also now appears to be timeless in a certain sense, since it is that which underlies the possibility of any determinately temporal occurrences. It is that which cannot occur and therefore has no temporal place. And here now, timelessness is conceived as a kind of lacking of within timeness, a merely negative notion, usually seen as arrived at by means of a transcendental argument, the conclusion of which is a mere presupposition. We could compare this actually with a remark that is made by Mies Bayenia in his book, Kant and the Problem of Nothingness, where he describes the form of time, which Kant describes as a nothing, an ens imaginarium, as a pure image deprived of ontological characteristics. So there's this negative characterization that it is a deprivation of some kind. It is what is left over when you've deprived sensibility of its contents. Okay, so the timelessness of the mere lack of temporal place or determination is the timelessness of time itself. It is, as Heidegger puts it, no more than saying that time is not in time. Now, Heidegger holds that Kant's insistence on the timelessness of the I is the result of, quote, shrinking back or recoiling from the realization that the representation grounding within timeness is the temporal that is not in time. In other words, Kant fails to see that this timelessness is merely a mode of temporality, the non-elapsing activity of generating empirical time. But for Kant, the temporal difference does not only yield this negative conception of timelessness, it is made possible by an atemporal I. Here is, I think, where we can see the limitations of Heidegger's critique. In the B deduction, Kant elaborates on how and why the faculty of sensibility is first given determination by the understanding. It is as part of this discussion that a famous footnote at B160 emerges, in which Kant clarifies that the formal intuitions of space and time are first given only thanks to an effect of the understanding. For space or time to be cognizable, as opposed to merely a way in which intuitions are given to the senses, they must exhibit the unity of a synthesis that does not belong to the senses. Indeed, for Kant, all combination is an act of the understanding spontaneity, and as such, there is no synthesis in sensibility alone. This does not mean that all synthesis presupposes particular concepts. As Kant says in this passage, in the Transcendental Aesthetic, in the footnote I'm referring to, he says that in the aesthetic, he ascribed unity of intuition to sensibility in order to indicate that it precedes all concepts. Nevertheless, this unity presupposes a synthesis of understanding. Hence, there's a general synthesis of the pure manifold of intuition prior to the application even of a particular concept. Far from reducing the pure intuition of time to a concept, then, Kant says that it is this act of understanding upon sensibility which first lets time be given as an intuition. When inner sense is determined by the synthetic act of the transcendental I, not only is its intuition made determinate, but he says, quote, we also always perceive this in ourselves. Kant's examples here are geometrical. We cannot think of a line without drawing it or a circle without describing it. but this inner perception of the line and the circle are determinate appearances, phenomena, corresponding to the determining act of thinking, the spontaneity of the understanding. Indeed, he says, we cannot even represent time without, in drawing a straight line, attending merely to the action of the synthesis of the manifold through which we successively determine the inner sense. This act of synthesis through which a manifold is made determinate is therefore not part of the determinate series. The act of the subject, what Kant calls motion of the subject, interestingly, first produces the concept of succession at all. That's a quote. So motion, Bewegung, here is sharply distinguished from motion of an object in space, since the latter is cognized through experience, while the former is, quote, pure act. In this sense, I think motion as pure act may be more accurately described in terms of the Aristotelian distinction between energia and dynamis, act and process. Motion as energia is not made up of temporal parts, nor does it serve as a temporal part in anything else. It doesn't become a unified act only after traversing a temporal series, but originally constitutes the possibility of a certain temporal series. Now, because in this pure act, we cognize this pure intuition as time, as a whole sphere, we are capable of recognizing objects in the flow of time as having their place within its whole sphere, just as with space, with respect to which geometry is possible only because it can cognize necessary spatial relationships within the whole of space. For Heidegger, likewise, the Bewegung of Dasein is, he says, quote, not the motion of something objectively present. It is determined from the stretching along of Dasein, the Erstrecktheit of Dasein, the constitution of the human being, which is prior to any objectively present stretch of life. The pure act here is a stretching along, but it is Dasein's temporal self-extension. In this way, it is not static and fixed, but ecstatic, or going outside of itself in order to generate the conditions under which determinate temporal moments can be grasped as such. But now a question must be asked about the kind of limits that are present in a pure stretching along versus in the act of understanding, right? The kind of stretching along that we're talking about is supposed to be a parallel between what Heidegger is talking about with Dasein's self-stretching in the generation of temporal dimensions, and Kant's notion of the pure act of the pure motion of the subject, which generates the concept of succession. But what are these such that they have the kind of limits that are both similar to each other and different from the limits that the understanding has? Because Kant clearly thinks that the understanding must affect and sort of create, right, or establish the pure motion of the subject, which is generating temporal moments. Now, the realm of appearances that always accompanies the determining act of the eye is that of successive occurrence. Attending merely to the successive character of appearances, it is easy to see that our appearing and disappearing representations occur against the background of a kind of temporal horizon. Within time, what appears is always disappearing in expectation of what comes next and carries with it some consciousness of what came before. And I could follow this series continually, anticipating ever further temporal conditions. But I will never, from this perspective, have cognition of the whole of time within which the series is constituted as a series. The horizon of temporal possibility surrounds me, but only as a limit which, when approached, recedes further into the distance. Heidegger does conceive of the limits of all intelligibility as horizon. He does not conceive of this horizon as the horizon that we merely glimpse within time, because he recognizes that our horizon is always glimpsed from Dasein's perspective of being the source of its self-stretching, right? So Dasein is, in a sense, identical with this pure act of stretching itself along and establishing the modes of time. In that sense, it has its temporal limits as a horizon, but not simply in the sense of, sort of being trapped within sensibility, right? It's somewhere between being inside sensibility and being the form of sensibility itself, I think, for Heidegger. Nevertheless, original temporality is a unity of the three factical horizons of time. As he puts it later, there is a strangeness, and this is in What is Metaphysics, there is a strangeness of the very fact of intelligibility, fundamentally inexplicable in further rational terms. In a very deep sense, Kant and Heidegger agree that temporality itself, apart from a determination from the understanding, is horizontal in just this way. The activity of generating within timeness is from within itself intelligible only so far, encountering its limits as one encounters the limits of a horizon. Here it might be important for us to consider, or instructive to consider, a couple of passages from the doctrine of method in the first critique. Kant says, first, if I represent the surface of the earth in accordance with sensible appearance as a plate, I cannot know how far it extends. But experience teaches me this, that wherever I go, I always see a space around me in which I could proceed farther. Thus, I cognize the limits of my actual knowledge of the earth at any time, but not the boundaries of all possible description. If I've gotten as far as knowing that the earth is a sphere and its surface, the surface of a sphere, then from a small part of the latter, for example, from the magnitude of 1 degree, I can cognize its diameter, and by means of this, the complete boundary. He then says, our reason is not like an indeterminably extended plane, the limits of which one can cognize only in general, but must rather be compared with a sphere, the radius of which can be found out from the curvature of an arc on its surface, from which its content and its boundary can also be ascertained with certainty. So if the earth appears to me merely from sensory affection, I mean, if we're taking this metaphor of the earth seriously, right? The earth sort of appears to me merely through sensory affection. I represent it merely as an indefinite plane that appears to extend at least as far as its horizon. Approaching this limit, it seems that I can always proceed further with nothing indicating a determinate endpoint. I therefore have a general idea of this limit, though because it is one which necessarily evades my grasp by providing the frame within which anything is graspable, it's not something I cognize determinately. It's therefore factical in Heidegger's terms, precisely because there's no further rational ground to be given for it. Now, Kant tells us that contra sensibility, reason knows its determinate bounds. The critical position seems to eliminate the possibility that reason has its limits horizontally, so to speak. A horizon for reason would be a condition upon which the capacity of reason rests. Specifically, it would be factical, or a brute ground of reason's necessary principles, determinacy, and of cognizability. It's commonly thought that Kant's critical system rests on such factical grounds, for example, because he admits that there are no further explanations to be given as to why the table of the forms of judgment is composed as it is, or why our forms of sensibility are spatial and temporal. But in the above doctrine of method passages, Kant appears to deny reason's facticity. If reason cognizes its own boundaries, as Kant says it must, then it thereby cognizes its own form completely. The formal limits of reason could not be limits that recede into the distance as they are approached. That is, limits which are known only in general, framing an indefinitely traversable space. Limits of this sort could only be noticed, like a mere negation or absence, but not known like the boundary that encloses a whole sphere. Kant illustrates this difference in the Prolegomena by saying that limits, shrunken, are merely negations that affect us and indicate the impossibility of completeness, while boundaries, Grenzen, presuppose a space that is found outside a certain fixed location. So to determine a boundary is to determine that there's a space on the other side of it. That doesn't necessitate cognition on the other side, but at least thought beyond the boundary. In thinking beyond it, the I is not contained by it, right? Necessarily. Insofar as the self-consciousness of reason is a determining activity, it is impossible for it to recognize itself as contained within limits of any kind. For any genuine recognition requires not merely noticing an inability, a mere negation, which can be felt by any creature with consciousness, but getting into view or grasping the limit as something given to my consciousness. In the latter case, if we could cognize this with determinacy, we would face the strange result of having purportedly objective cognition of limits, which cannot themselves be criticized. It seems that the eye of reason must always be beyond its limits, determining them, but never contained in them, lest we sacrifice the objectivity of cognition generally. So I'll skip ahead here because I only have a minute or two. how this all bears on time can become a bit clearer now. Kant explains reason's unity of consciousness as the source of determinacy as such, and therefore the source of the determination of the character of time as a whole. If so, then the timelessness of the I consists in its understanding itself to be exempt from all temporal conditions. This is important, I think. The I is a consciousness of its not being bound by time, I think, for Kant, right? So it isn't just that Kant finds a way that this representation that accompanies my other cognition, all my cognition, is somehow not affected by time in and of itself, right? It's rather that the I is a self-consciousness. It is a consciousness of itself, but the kind of consciousness that it has of itself necessarily rejects a horizontal limit for itself. And therefore, it must reject time insofar as temporality is a horizontal limit. That's not just to say that the I is not temporally determinate or within time, but also that the limits of the I are not temporal limits, I think. Now, okay, so I need to skip to the very end, to the conclusion. Very quickly before concluding, we now seem to have on the table two notions of timelessness in Kant, where atemporality in Kant turns out to be not just a mere misstep or recoil from the truth of timelessness that even Heidegger recognizes, the merely negative notion. Atemporality cannot refer simply to the Nunc-stans of eternal presence, since it is the rejection of all temporal characterization whatsoever. It is also, therefore, not a slide back into dogmatic metaphysics. All of this rests on Kant's attempt to understand how self-consciousness is, from within itself, a cognition of its own limits and application, how it is critical. So I just want to end with that, basically saying that this idea that Kant and Heidegger disagree about what the ultimate limits of intelligibility are, or what the ultimate conditions of intelligibility are, is nothing new. But the idea that somehow Kant shrinks back from the idea of temporality, I think should be resisted, right? And I think it should be resisted because Kant really has in view here some very clear reasons for why temporality could not be a condition of the I, at least as the I is in and of itself. So there's a lot more to say, but we can move into the Q&A part of things and say more in that modality. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Professor Ellis, for this very stimulating thought. I think as we need to keep an eye on time, we should immediately proceed with the Q&A, and therefore, I don't know how we should proceed. Maybe Professor Westphal first. Oh, that's actually not a, sorry. Yeah, who would like to go first? Oh, Professor De Boer, please.
Okay, so just to get started, yes, I wasn't sure whether we were going to have the Q&A immediately or at the end. Yes, so maybe we need some time to think about a good question. But Edison, thanks for your paper. I thought it was very interesting, but I also was wondering if Kant's account of the I and time on the one hand, and Heidegger's account of Dasein and temporality and the act of, or just the stretching out, the movement of stretching out, if the two approaches aren't too different to warrant a comparison, yes, or to assess them according to the same kind of criterion. Because it seems to me that Kant's had something very different in mind by distinguishing between the I qua self-consciousness that distinguishes itself from the sequence of representations that it, as it were, observes. Yeah, so the I, as it were, states all the time, it's not me. Yes, I'm not the redness, I'm not the coldness. All of that occurs in time in the sequence of inner sense, but it's not me. And I think that this idea, or this way of distinguishing between the capacity of the ego to withdraw from the sequence of representations that it observes is something very different from Heidegger's more existentialist idea as to the way in which the human being creates for itself a future in relation to its own past or history. Yeah, so I value your attempt to think of them together, and Heidegger, of course, also does this. But the question is, well, are they talking past each other or not? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That's a really good question. It's a good question because, as you know, right, the really complicated thing about thinking through the relation between Kant and Heidegger is thinking through the ways in which not only are they similar and different, but in which Heidegger himself thought that they were similar and different, and whether those match or not, right? As you mentioned, right, Heidegger does think that, as he thinks of many figures in the history of philosophy, he thinks of them as prefiguring his own work. I think he understands very clearly that there is one of the perhaps the fundamental difference between the two of them is that Kant thinks that the ultimate limits, or sorry, the ultimate conditions of intelligibility are cognitive or rational. And although that can be disputed, I mean, perhaps my colleague Ahmed will have something to say about the third critique as a kind of maybe there's something less cognitive going on here, depending on how you see the role of the third critique in relation to the others. But I think that Heidegger thinks, look, Kant, the thing, in a way, they're talking past each other because Kant thinks that the ultimate conditions are cognitive and Heidegger doesn't. And so, of course, anything that they then say about self-consciousness and its relation to temporality and that's relation to appearances and so on is going to be completely colored by that basic difference. But I think that, as you also mentioned, that Heidegger seizes deep similarity between what they're both doing. Heidegger does sometimes criticize Kant for seeing time as a continuous series of nows rather than as ecstatic, for instance. But then he reads the threefold synthesis as though it's sort of right there already in Kant, the unity of ecstatic temporality. It's just that Kant didn't sort of tease that out of it himself, right? It's like it's there, but Kant didn't really do the necessary work to figure it out. You know, the synthesis of recognition there is sort of the primarily futural mode which synthesizes the other two, past and present, and so on. And so I think Heidegger really sees the potential there. He sees what's already there, but not brought out by Kant. And in that way, I think it's perfectly legitimate to see them as speaking to each other. But the complicated thing, as I mentioned, is that there's also a respect in which they're not, right? So they're very different, and yet they're very, very similar. And I think ultimately, you know, a kind of scholarship on the Kant-Heidegger relation really needs to get to this bottom layer of things, which is how could they possibly resolve a dispute over whether the ultimate conditions of intelligibility are rational or not? Or is there any resolve? And maybe your suggestion, I don't know, is that all they can do is just sort of do their different maybe all they can do is beg the question against each other, right? I kind of think, though, that that doesn't have to be the case, because I think that, you know, Kant could say, perhaps, to Heidegger that even you, Heidegger, can't make sense of objectivity. Fine, you think objectivity isn't the sort of the primary thing, but you can't make sense of objective cognition unless you conceive of the ultimate conditions of intelligibility in a particular way that you don't. Sorry, I don't know if that helps or makes any sense, but it's a very complicated set of relations, and yet there's this very simple disagreement, I think, at the very bottom.
Yeah, I think this kind of discourse in the interaction between the two of you has come into view. And let us move on to the next question, to Laura Pellegrini, I think.
Hi, yes, I'm sorry, I'm with the cell phone because my computer is not working. I have two questions. The first one is on the concept of freedom. In my opinion, but I would like to know yours, one of the problems that Heidegger has in his interpretation is how to explain freedom, because within the Kantian system, one of the grounds of the possibility of freedom is detaching the ego from time. That is to say, the timeless ego is the possibility, one of the grounds of the possibility of explaining freedom. When Heidegger puts the ego into time, then, in my opinion, but I'd like to know yours, he has like a big problem in explaining the possibility of transcendental freedom and therefore of practical freedom. So I have two questions. That's the first one.
Yeah. So you're saying that Heidegger has a problem explaining practical freedom, or that he thinks Kant has a problem explaining the possibility?
No, Heidegger, because what my point would be that within the Kantian system, the possibility of transcendental freedom is grounded on the non-temporal I, that is to say, detaching the I from time and therefore from nature, and is the grounds of explaining the possibility of freedom. And I don't know how Heidegger would solve this problem. I know that, for instance, in the Castle Conference, he tried to do so, but in my opinion, he cannot. Putting the ego into time, then he cannot explain the possibility of freedom. Heidegger has a problem with that, in my opinion, but I don't know. I would like to know also yours.
Yeah, it's a really big question. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think that one thing Heidegger might try to say in this regard is that perhaps, right, that the factical conditions that are the horizontal background, as it were, of freedom are not threatening to freedom because they're not causal in the right way, right? I think that one criticism he has of Kant's notion of freedom, which I also disagree with, I think it's not a good argument, but he thinks that where Kant went wrong is that Kant thought of absolute spontaneity in practical freedom as a kind of cause. But he didn't figure out that it's just a kind of cause and not sort of the ground of all possible causes or something like this, right? And so this typical Heidegger move, he didn't sort of do fundamental ontology, he just did regional ontology, and that was Kant's fault. But I think, and so I think that's a clue, right? I think Heidegger himself probably thinks of freedom as something that is not causal in any sort of classical sense, and therefore whatever the sort of presuppositions that are groundless, contingent, factical presuppositions, and therefore temporal and not outside of time, whatever those are, they're not threatening to freedom because they're not going to be sort of causal sequences that determine our actions. They're just going to be somehow kind of ways of relating into the past and future that we have to acknowledge are sort of outside of us and yet not completely outside of us, right? This is always also a move that Heidegger makes, is that the ecstasies of time is such that you're kind of, the Dasein is sort of going outside of itself, but it's still Dasein, right? And so it's freedom, but it's not atemporal freedom. I don't know if that helps.
No, I understand your point. Yes, thank you for your answer. And the second question, I don't know if I have time for that one. It's a short one. Is on the concept of succession. I am interested in knowing how do we understand the concept of succession within the Kantian system, and particularly because certainly time does not elapse, but however, time is the form of succession. As space is the one outside the other, time is the one after the other, which establishes not only succession, but a very peculiar kind of succession with the dependence of the one after the other and so on. So I'm interested in understanding how do you understand the concept of succession within the Kantian system?
Yeah, I mean, what I try to say is that succession, as you put it very, very nicely, time is the form of succession or the consciousness of succession. So in succession, I think that there's succession that could belong to, for instance, non-rational animals, right? So there's mere temporal difference. So, the squirrel notices one time and notices another time, but he doesn't notice them successively, right? So there's temporal difference. But then there's succession. Succession requires at least ascending to the level of the synthesis of reproduction, right? Of being able to situate an occurrence with relation to a prior one in accordance with a kind of rule. And so that means succession requires a unity of consciousness that is common to the parts of the succession. So I think that's what he means when he says, that, the consciousness of inner sense, the consciousness of time is the form of succession. That just means that in order for there to be one thing after another, it has to be that there's a unity of consciousness common to each node of that nexus, as it were. And that means that there's a non-elapsing consciousness that is sort of temporal in the sense that it's the form of all of that. Yeah, I think that's how he's thinking of it.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Yes, so in my capacity as the clock in this discourse on time, allow me to limit ourselves now to the question by Professor Westphal. I'm sorry, dear Farhad, but I think it would be important to proceed as we have planned. Professor Westphal.
Thank you very much for letting me in at the last moment here. To be brief, what I'm going to do is comment and leave it for later for people to think about it if they wish. And I first want to compliment the paper and the speaker, right? That was very astute, and I appreciate how well you succeeded in those regards. Now, you used the phrase also here in the discussion, ascribing to Kant the view that the ultimate conditions of intelligibility are cognitive. And I've got two linked questions about that. When you talk about the ultimate, sounds like it's supposed to be, grammatically it completes that, right? Or all of them cognitive, or are some of them cognitive? Or rather, are these cognitive conditions solely intellectual, that is, conceptual and judgmental? But I don't think that that's where Kant leaves his analysis. And I would suggest linking what you did mention, the threefold sensory synthesis, to what he says in a couple of different places about the transcendental affinity of the sensory manifold, and then link those to the refutation of idealism, right? Because he does not think that the conditions for our possibility of using our conceptual and judgmental, and for that matter, sensory forms of intuition are themselves merely formal. Right? We have to be able to use those in connection with, average everydayness, right? This, getting lunch, finding where the door is, whatever else, right? They'll have to be brought by us to bear upon concrete particulars of whatever sorts. Here's one. And when you put those aspects of Kant's first critique together, there's a much stronger convergence between Heidegger's fundamental ontology of being in the world and the actualization, actual use of these formal resources of cognition, both intellectual and sensory. I'll stop there because I know the time's gone.
Well, thank you very much for that. I will certainly be thinking about this, and maybe I'll be able to formulate a thought at some point later. It's a very good, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, so a lot of food for thought, not only for dear Edison, but also for the other ones. Thank you very much, dear Edison, for this highly interesting paper.
Thank you, everybody.
Allow me now to introduce you the second member of the philosophy department of the American University in Cairo that is presenting a paper on Kant today, namely Professor Richard Fincher. He worked on Kant and his relation to British empiricism on the one hand, and on the relation of Kant and early German idealism on the other hand, one might say. Accordingly, his publications comprise contributions like Kant, Hume, and the Ontological Argument, which is upcoming in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy in the next months. But he has also written papers like Schelling's Subversion of Fichtean Monism or his Transcendental Idealism and the Problem of the External World, published in the Journal of the History of Philosophy. The paper he presents today deals with the tricky question, to what extent is the inaugural dissertation dogmatic? The floor is yours, dear Richard.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, as Alexandro pointed out, I have been for a long time very much interested in the question of the origins of the critique of pure reason, and specifically how to understand the emergence of Kant's critical philosophy as a response to Hume's empiricism and Hume's skepticism. I spent a number of years now really focusing on Kant's work and how it's related to Hume within the 1760s. The upcoming paper that Alessandro referred to will discuss some of the relationships between the first inquiry and Kant's Beweisgrund, the only possible argument for the existence of God, which I hope will show that it's actually very much possible that Hume influenced Kant's very famous and well-known knockdown critique of the ontological argument. But anyway, that's forthcoming. What I decided to present today is some relatively new reflections, trying to push things forward. I've been avoiding the inaugural dissertation for a couple of years, and I thought it was about time that I grabbed the bull by the horns and tried to work out for myself precisely where the inaugural dissertation stands in connection with my own beliefs and ideas about the way in which Hume influenced Kant's philosophy, and how the critical philosophy can be seen as a response to Hume. Okay, so this is very much work in progress. I shall read out the text of the paper and share my screen at intervals, just so that people can see the specific passages from the text that I'm referring to. Okay, let me do just one moment. I wasn't quite. That's okay. That's better. Just, okay. Well, let me begin. Okay, so when investigating Kant's intellectual development, one finds little consensus about the precise status of 1770s inaugural dissertation. This is especially so within discussions concerning when and how Kant's dogmatic slumber was first interrupted by David Hume. For in the literature...
Richard, sorry to interrupt. Were you going to share your screen?
Yes, I will do at various intervals, but I've...
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry to interrupt. Yes.
Okay. So in the literature, one finds that for however many scholars there are who claim that this interruption occurred 1 or 2 years before the dissertation, there are an almost equal number of scholars who instead argue that this decisive influence occurred at least 1 or 2 years after it. For the former, the dissertation is the product of Kant's break with the dogmatic metaphysics of the Leibnizian Wolffian school, and shows him, following a skeptical crisis, making his first attempt at sketching a truly scientific critical philosophy. For the latter, the dissertation represents Kant's last attempt at the very kind of dogmatic metaphysics that the critical philosophy will turn against. It is this disagreement that makes the status of the dissertation so pressing. I'll confess at the outset that I side with the aforementioned first group of scholars in believing that the interruption of dogmatic slumber precedes Kant's work on the dissertation. I here attempt to justify this stance by arguing that the dissertation can be seen as Kant's first steps upon a completely different direction in the field of speculative philosophy that the prolegomenous preface credits Hume with inspiring. So let us turn now to that preface. Okay. So in this preface, Kant tells us that Hume brought no light to metaphysical knowledge, but that he struck a spark from which a light could well have been kindled. He struck a spark by arguing that reason has no power to think a single concept in metaphysics, namely that of the connection of cause and effect and its derivative concepts of force and action. And in so doing, he questioned whether the concept of cause has an inner truth independent of all experience, and therefore also a much more widely extended use, which is not limited to objects of experience. Accordingly, we can say that Hume struck a spark by challenging reason's insight into a specific relation between our concepts of objects that cannot be explained in terms of reason's law of identity and non-contradiction, but that he brought no light to metaphysical knowledge, since he concluded that if such a connection cannot be explained in terms of identity and contradiction, then reason has no power to think such a relation a priori at all. And this conclusion, if accepted, threatens pretensions to possess ampliative metaphysical cognition. Kant, however, dismisses this conclusion as premature and erroneous. Hume's question concerning reason's insight into real grounds and consequences was, Kant says, well-grounded, but he criticizes Hume's treatment of it as underdeveloped. He thus writes that Hume's conclusions arose solely because he did not completely set out his problem, but only touched on a part of it, which without the whole being taken into account, can provide no enlightenment. So Kant thus criticizes Hume for starting mainly from one single concept in metaphysics, namely that of the connection of cause and effect, and not investigating all metaphysical concepts through which the understanding thinks connections of things a priori, implying that when the whole is taken into account, a completely different answer to Hume's question becomes possible. As the preface proceeds, Kant continues to describe how his own attempt to take the whole into account gave rise to the first critique's metaphysical and transcendental deductions, which admittedly seemingly grants support to the view of the aforementioned second group of scholars that it was after the dissertation that Hume interrupted Kant's dogmatic slumber and drove him to answer his question. This, however, need not be the case, and it may be that, as I shall argue here, Kant's first attempt to take the whole into account and answer Hume's question, in fact, occurs within the dissertation. Support for my view is, in fact, provided later within the Prolegomena, namely within Prolegomena section 39, in which Kant remarks upon how his separation of the pure elementary concepts of sensibility from those of the understanding occurred after long reflection during an investigation of the pure elements of human cognition, containing nothing empirical. For this implies that, inspired by Hume, Kant has already embarked on the project of investigating all metaphysical concepts through which the understanding thinks connections of things a priori, before he discovered that spatio-temporal relations are distinct from relations between cause and effect in not primarily having their seat in the understanding, and thus discovered the ideality of space and time. Since this ideality is already at work within the dissertation, this passage suggests that Kant was working on answering Hume's question long before it. And further evidence for this view is provided by the autobiographical reflection 5116, which I now have on the left-hand side of the screen. There, Kant describes how it was only after finding the whole dogmatic theory dialectical that he gradually found that many of the propositions that we regard as objective are in fact subjective. That is to say that they contain the conditions under which alone we can have insight into or comprehend the object. And this implies that Kant had undergone a full awakening from dogmatic slumber and a skeptical crisis before discovering the dissertation's idealism. Writing about the dissertation in a letter to Lambert of September 1770, Kant says that for perhaps a year now, I have arrived at a position that I shall never have to change, from which all sorts of metaphysical questions can be examined according to wholly certain and easy criteria, and the extent to which these questions can or cannot be resolved will be decidable with certainty. And this suggests that Kant sees the idealism of the dissertation as heralding a truly scientific metaphysics, reconciling the labyrinths in which the dogmatic version of the same became embroiled. The discovery of this position a year earlier is described in reflection 5037 on the right-hand side of the screen there, where Kant writes, "Initially, I saw this doctrine as if in a twilight. I tried quite earnestly to prove propositions and their opposites, not in order to establish skeptical doctrine, but rather because I suspected I could discover in what an illusion of the understanding was hiding. The year 1769 gave me a great light." And this passage grants us insight into the embryogenesis of the dissertation's idealism. By 1769, Kant had been awakened from the dogmatism of Leibnizian Wolffian metaphysics. He had discovered that all its alleged metaphysical cognitions could be counterpoised by the equipolant counterclaims of an antagonist. But in so doing, he had made a discovery into the nature of such theses and antitheses. One set of propositions are concluded on the basis of subjective temporal conditions under which we comprehend objects, but the other set of propositions are concluded on the basis of concepts through which, divorced from temporal conditions, the intellect thinks the relations of objects in themselves. Considerations concerning the former allowed Kant to formulate transcendental idealism, whereas considerations concerning the latter enabled him to give his first tentative account of a whole system of concepts of connections fought by the understanding a priori. We can conclude, therefore, that the Great Light of 1769 not only denotes the discovery of transcendental idealism, but that it also denotes a light that Kant kindled from a spark provided by Hume. Now, section 1 of the dissertation and the concluding section of the dissertation, section 5, grants us insight into how Kant may have used a skeptical method to uncover a systematic whole of concepts through which the understanding thinks connections a priori, about which there could be scientific consensus. These sections focus upon the idea of the world whole, an abstract and universal a priori concept generated out of the very nature of the mind. Kant proceeds to define this abstract idea, uncovering its characteristic marks, and thus isolating other a priori concepts universally fought within it. Accordingly, it is revealed that our a priori idea of a world is the concept of an immutable and everlasting whole of coalescing component parts, which by definition cannot itself be a component part of any other whole and is thus a totality. The components of this totality are immutable substances, and if all composition were removed, the world would thus dissolve into an infinity of simple substances. Composition is, however, eternally sustained insofar as the coalescence of substances is grounded by a single principle, namely the supreme being, God. In being the source from which these immutable substances derive their existence, God exists necessarily, whereas the substances constituting the world exist contingently. Skepticism concerning whether the world in itself must be fought in this way, and the labyrinths into which the previous metaphysical tradition has lost itself when thinking the world, result from following up this idea with the sensitive faculty of cognition, to thus think the concept of the world through the temporal conditions by which our faculty of intuition is constrained. Accordingly, since the sensitive faculty of cognition can only coordinate series of representations according to temporal conditions, it is assumed that in being unrepresentable, the eternity and totality of the world are impossible. Likewise, that the sensitive faculty of cognition's capacity for analysis depends upon temporal conditions leads to the supposition that there can be, quote, no regress in the composition of the parts of the world to infinity, implying that the material of the world cannot consist in an infinity of coalescing simples. Furthermore, the world's contingency and dependency on God is misinterpreted by the sensitive faculty of cognition's temporal conditions to produce the erroneous supposition that at some point in time the world did not exist at all, and that it was created by God at a determinate point in time. So we can thus understand how Kant's position in the dissertation emerged from him trying quite earnestly to prove propositions and their opposite. He thus, for example, juxtaposes the thesis concerning the eternity of the world with the antithesis that its past duration must be measurable, and the thesis concerning the divisibility of the world into an infinity of simples with the antithesis that its components must contain a determinate number of parts. We can thus see how Kant was not doing this to establish a skeptical doctrine, since rather than counterpoising thesis and antithesis to prove our ignorance, he was proving that the conflicts only emerge insofar as what is true for the concepts of the pure understanding are juxtaposed with conditions which are true for our subjective faculty of intuition. The temporal conditions under which our sensitive faculty of cognition operates produces a subjective resistance when we try to follow up the concepts of pure understanding and represent them to ourselves. The unrepresentability of the pure understanding's concepts does not mean, however, that the pure understanding's conclusions about the objective nature of the world in itself are impossible. Two, on the contrary, like the proponents of the aforementioned antitheses, conclude objective impossibility from subjective resistance is to be guilty of what Kant calls the metaphysical fallacy of subrection. In identifying and disarming such fallacious reasoning, the dissertation thus serves as a specimen of a propadeutical science that would be a prerequisite for any truly scientific metaphysics. At this point in his career, Kant therefore clearly believes that by abstracting the temporal conditions through which we comprehend and represent concepts from the concepts and ideas of the pure understanding, one will uncover within its purity a systematic whole of the metaphysical concepts through which the understanding thinks connections a priori, about which there should be a scientific consensus akin to that found within mathematics. It would thus seem, therefore, that in the dissertation, Kant has already embarked upon the project described within the prolegomena preface of outlining all of the concepts through which the understanding thinks connections of things a priori. Does then his account of the systematic whole of those concepts succeed in providing an answer to Hume's more specific question concerning whether the understanding thinks the connection of cause and effect, together with its derivative concept of force a priori? That it does so, I would argue, is suggested generally various places, but more specifically by sections 2 and sections 22 of the dissertation, well, paragraph 2 and paragraph 22, which I shall show on the screen now. So to see how this is the case, one must remember that the concept of the world is not abstracted from what is sensitive, but is rather a pure idea given by the pure understanding upon which the sensitive faculty of cognition follows up by abortively attempting to represent it. The world is thus the idea of a real objective totality of substances, which in order to constitute a whole must coalesce. There must thus be a real connection between these substances in order that they constitute a whole. The substances of the world are thus reciprocally connected with one another in such a way that they may possibly influence one another. Like Hume before him, Kant seemingly accepts that transient forces which are the causes of any actual influence do not belong to the essences of substances themselves, but are merely concepts of the relations between one substance and the state of another. Far from placing their seat within the imagination, however, Kant places them within the principle that sustains the very existence of all substances, namely God. It is God, therefore, who in making a multiplicity of substances coalesce to form a whole, ensures that they are mutually related to one another by transient forces, and thus can possibly really influence one another. Kant thus tells us that if you abandon this principle, in other words, if you abandon God, you are debarred from positing as possible a transient force in the world. In fact, it would seem that in accordance with Kant's argument, we should go further and claim that if we abandoned God, we would be debarred from positing the existence of one unified world. Kant thus seems willing to grant that one can infer the existence of God from the existence of one unified world, suggesting at one point that it is God's omnipresence that appears to us as space, just as it is God's eternity that is intuited by us as time. But Kant remains skeptical, however, about whether it would be possible to argue in the opposed direction and deduce the form of the world from the idea of God. If this were possible, however, then Kant tells us that the fundamental connection of substances would be proven not to be contingent, but necessary, and that the interaction between them would be real and physical, arising in accordance with common rules. He then curiously claims that even though this form of the world has not been demonstrated, that is to say, that it has not been deduced from the existence and nature of God, it has nonetheless, he says, been rendered fully acceptable for other reasons. But we are not explicitly told what those other reasons are. But we may suppose that it is simply definition and hence analysis of the understanding's idea of a world, purified of any sensitive admixture, that reveals that the understanding must think of the world as a real whole, and thus as a whole in which its component substances are really and physically necessarily connected with one another and influence one another by means of transient forces. In this way, Kant thus answers Hume's question by claiming that the concepts of necessary connection and force are ones into which reason possesses insight a priori, insofar as they are necessary elements contained within the pure understanding's idea of the world. Cognition of the possibility of particular forces, Kant insists, can only be given by experience, and is thus, as Kant had argued in his Dreams of a Spirit Seer, limited to those pertaining to relations between spatial phenomena and not immaterial substances. But against Hume, the contention that reason has the power to think necessary connection in general is nonetheless justified. So to conclude, this paper has thus argued that the dissertation provides an early attempt on Kant's part to answer the objection of David Hume, and that it is thus consequent to the interruption of Kant's dogmatic slumber. If this is correct, then it would be the case that its composition was subsequent to a skeptical crisis that saw Kant rejecting the metaphysics of the Leibnizian Wolffian school and embarking upon a new project of formulating a truly scientific metaphysics. That the dissertation should indeed be read in this way is suggested by how, like the Critique of Pure Reason itself, it is conceived of as outlining a propaedeutical science, providing the conditions under which a truly scientific metaphysics might emerge. In spite of that, however, it must nevertheless be acknowledged that the position Kant maintains within it is sharply distinct from the mature critical philosophy in describing not only concepts and principles in terms of which the understanding must think, but concepts and principles in terms of which the pure understanding cognizes noumena. In Kant's own words, therefore, the dissertation's pure concepts of the understanding have a dogmatic use in leading us to cognition of God. And when reflecting upon the dissertation in the late 1770s, this is the passage now on the screen at the left, Kant acknowledges that within it, he was outlining a method for extended dogmatic cognition through pure reason. On the other hand, however, as we have seen in passing, the dissertation rejects the dogmatic method of demonstratively deducing conclusions more geometrico, and thus marks the rejection of the Leibnizian metaphysics then in vogue. In terms of the Critique of Pure Reason's definition of dogmatism, it must be confessed that the dissertation does contain a dogmatic residuum. But in marking Kant's first attempt at outlining a metaphysics enjoying scientific consensus, it must be acknowledged to be a first attempt at establishing a critical philosophy, a tantalizing glimpse, perhaps, at the critical philosophy that may have been, as opposed to the one that ultimately came. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Richard, for this new contextualization of the dissertation. Let us immediately move to the first questions. Sorry, if I've seen things correctly, Rodica Kuraturu was the first one, and Farhad would be the second.
Thank you. Well, my question is, if possible, what is the specific to the concept of substance from the inaugural dissertation to prolegomena? Eventually, maybe a relationship with matter, because after that, Kant's conception on substance changed in the Metaphysischen Pangsgründe. Then, in this, between the inaugural dissertation and prolegomena, please. What is specific for to the concept of substance?
Well, I mean, what I think is a very great difference is that within the inaugural dissertation, I mean, the substances that Kant is referring to seem to be very much noumenal substances. I mean, we are talking about things in themselves. We are talking about things in themselves, noumena that appear to us within space and time. This seems to be very different from the critical philosophy's conception of substance, where it seems as though one could talk about phenomenal substances. One conceives of substance as something which is constructed by the to a certain extent constructed by the spontaneous activity of the understanding. This is something that I think, one major distinction between what we see within the inaugural dissertation and the critical philosophy is that although the passive faculty of sensibility clearly has a role in constituting our experience, it doesn't seem as though the understanding has no specific role in constituting our experience or conditioning our experience. It rather seems that it's rather the case that what exists within itself is to some extent appearing to us within our forms of space and time, but we're not actively involved in conditioning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. So let us move on to the next question by Farhad, please.
Thank you so much for this super interesting talk. So I have two brief questions. The first one is a bit technical. Do we know for sure what texts Kant had access to? Because there's a big debate that he didn't know about the treatise, the Humean account of geometry is synthetic, and Kant could only read the inquiry. And I don't know if it was translated to him or he had some notes that he could know what is happening in inquiry. So that is my first question, to know what sources Kant had literally to read him. So my second concern with your suggestion is that you're establishing a link between Kant's critique of Hume to the dissertation, but part of that answer, as I read it, is the possibility of the synthetic a priori judgments, and that is a doctrine which is totally lacking. We don't see such discussion in dissertation. So I can understand that, of course, if you want to tackle the dogmatic philosophy, you have to divide the worlds into intelligible and sensibility to say, okay, we are done with the dogmatic philosophy. But I don't see his answer to Hume up to that point. So I don't see why you're suggesting that at this stage, Kant is able philosophically to respond to Hume's concern. Yeah, even the passage you quoted, that Hume could only see analyticity, it provides a scheme, because the Kantian answer is that, okay, we have synthetic a priori judgments, but the connection between the two worlds is not established in the dissertation, and it only comes about in the first critique. And in that light, Kant cannot answer to Hume at that stage. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay. Well, I mean, in terms of the sources, I mean, I think in a sense it's less of a debate, but more of a consensus. I think the consensus tends to be that Kant really had no access to Hume's treatise whatsoever. He did from a very early point in time have access to the inquiry that appeared in German translation as part of Sulzer's Vermischte Schriften as early as 1755. We know that Kant owned a copy of Sulzer's edition of the inquiry, which appeared in 4 volumes with other texts as well. The second inquiry was within there. The natural history of religion was in there. So we know that Kant, in theory, had access to these texts within German translation, possibly from 1755. In 1756, Mendelssohn famously says that this edition of Hume's inquiry is in everybody's hands. Whether it had reached Königsberg yet, we don't know, but presumably it wasn't far away. So it seems to be, that Kant would have certainly had access to the inquiry, would have known the inquiry very, very well. The treatise is probably a closed book. He might have known fragments of it. Of course, there is there was, of course, the treatise 147 that was translated by Hamann, which appeared within the Königsberg Journal within 1771. There were a few translations of passages from the treatise that appeared within a German translation of Beattie's The Nature and Immutability of Truth, which appeared within 1772. But the treatise was not translated in Germany until 1792, I think. So really, when we're talking about Kant's knowledge of Hume, I think it's possible, very possible, that Kant never owned a copy of the treatise throughout the course of his entire life. He probably may well have been impossible for Kant to have actually read the treatise throughout the course of his entire life. I mean, not during during his formative years, but I mean also within his later years as well. At the same time, he would have had access to the inquiry during his formative years, and probably knew it quite well, and he almost certainly owned a copy. Now, in terms of the work that I have been doing, I mean, I've been really working on the assumption that Kant possessed the inquiry, and that Hume, and that his references to Hume throughout certainly his pre-critical work, but probably even the critical work as well, is primarily referencing the inquiry. And at the same time, however, one can find that if one studies the inquiry very closely, you can actually find that there is much more in it than is often supposed. For instance, I mean, I don't want to plug my upcoming article in the British Journal of History of Philosophy, but it was been supposed for years and years and years that there was some sort of analogies between Hume's reflections about existence in the treatise and Kant's critique of the ontological argument within the Critique of Pure Reason. And yet, because it was supposed that Kant could not have read the treatise, and almost certainly did not read the treatise, it was thought that there couldn't have been any sort of influence. There couldn't have been any lines of influence between Hume's remarks about existence and Kant's famous knockdown critique of the Cartesian version of the ontological argument. But I think that if one really looks closely at certain parts of the inquiry, when Hume reflects not what he calls the concept of existence, but just when we reflect about what Hume says about what it is that convinces us, what it is that makes us believe that something exists, that something is objectively real as opposed to a mere fiction. When we concentrate, we look closely at Hume's account of belief within section 5, part 2 of the inquiry, one can actually find, I think, although expressed within slightly different language, but you can find there the thesis that existence is not a predicate. And this could have influenced Kant. This could have influenced the Beweisgrund. So this is what I'm arguing. So my in a sense the assumption upon which I work or have been working is that if we really read the inquiry very closely, we can find that it actually contains much more material than a lot of people actually suppose. And we can perhaps also think of Kant as having read it very closely also, and having derived a lot of inspiration from it. Okay, so in regard to your second question, I mean, I'll admit that in the inaugural dissertation, Kant still has not arrived at the explicit question concerning a priori synthetic judgments. Now, there is evidence, certainly, that this is something that Kant actually arrived at very late in the day. So it seems that, by his own admission, I mean, that there is a somewhere, I can't remember precisely the source, but I have used it in the past. Kant does indeed sort of talk in terms of say something along the lines, very, very late in the day, that I actually realized that all of the problems of pure reason can be expressed in terms of this one formula, how are a priori synthetic judgments possible? So, okay, it was sometimes when one reads the critique, particularly if one is reading the second edition of the critique, it really sort of looks as if this was Kant's starting point. But it was only sort of Kant's starting point in retrospect. In terms of his actual historical development, it seems to have been something that a formulation that he arrived at very, very late in the day. I don't think that, well, he's not thinking in these terms within the inaugural dissertation, but this doesn't mean that he's not inspired by Hume at this point. If one looks at that passage from the Prolegomena, the preface from the Prolegomena, we find that Kant is not talking about, he's not talking about synthetic judgments a priori. He's, his account of the Humean question, the Humean objection that inspired him, there are various different conceptions as to precisely what it amounts to. But I mean, in terms of the actual language Kant is using, he's not talking about a priori synthesis. He's not yet talking about a priori synthesis. Now, my own view about what it is, the problem that Kant is discussing within the Prolegomena is that I think that within the 1760s, Kant is concerned simply with the fact that he realizes that when it comes to simple relations between objects, the relation between cause and effect is being a simple relation between two objects that cannot be accounted for in terms of identity and contradiction. We can't analyze the concept of the cause and discover within the concept of the cause the force that necessarily connects that cause with the effect. And I think what Kant is specifically worried about is reason's ability to think these sorts of relations. And I think also there's also a relation, even a relation between this and his concerns about existence not being a predicate as well. When it comes to questions concerning existence, we can't analyze the concept of an object in order to determine whether or not the object exists. We're simply dealing with some sort of simple relationship between the object and we ourselves as a subject. With cause and effect, we're dealing with a similar kind of simple relationship between the cause and the effect. Reason doesn't seem to have any kind of insight into it. This, I think, is the problem that Kant discovers within the early 1760s, I think. And later on, it becomes expressed in terms of the question of a priori synthesis. But if one looks closely at the account of Hume's problem within the Prolegomena's preface, you find he's not talking about a priori synthesis at all. I mean, he's talking specifically about the concept of necessary connection, the concept of force. He's not talking about the causal principle. He's not talking about the causal axiom. He's not even talking about simply the concept of cause. It seems that when he starts talking, he's talking about specifically the concept of necessary connection and its derivative concept of force, which in itself is a component part of the concept of cause. So, I don't think that the Hume inspired Kant, or that Kant understood Hume's question to be about an a priori synthetic judgments about whether or not everything that happens has a cause. I don't even think that he was inspired specifically by concerns about what Hume said, specifically about the concept of cause and effect. I think what really, really troubled Kant was that he was troubled by what Hume had said, what Hume had discovered about the simple concept of necessary connection and force.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much to both of you for the very, a good question which allowed to further elucidate fine differences. I wanted to make the following suggestion. As we are running a bit out of time, Professor Westphal, would you really like to just bring into view the question that you have in mind, and then we could go into a 3 minutes break? Is that possible?
Yes. Thank you very much. There's more to Kant's access to Hume than the not terribly good translation by Sulzer of the Inquiry. The last section of book one of the treatise was translated by Hamann and published in his own journal in 1771.
Yes.
And it was only very recently that people figured out this was actually Hume. It wasn't Hamann's work. But Kant and Hamann were in frequent contact, and Kant certainly would have known of this translation, and very likely would have known that it was a translation from Hume. And the other part, the second part, is that Tayton's, too, is a conduit. Perhaps not so much of Hume, but of Reid. And despite Kant's apparently dismissive remarks about Reid and common sense philosophy, Kant took over exactly Reid's account of sensation and sensations, whereby they are not objects of our awareness, they are subpersonal components of our acts of perceiving stuff in our surroundings. And there's a lot of the Reid that Kant gets fairly directly, and there's a lot that he gets through Tayton's. So it's not quite the chokehold. But the third thing is this: if you scrutinize the first inquiry, it's not so hard to figure out what Hume is committed to as a philosophical view. And Kant is smart enough to have reconstructed book one of the treatise out of the inquiry. So,
yeah.
And it's in that last book of the treatise, which Kant translated, that he talks about causality as an illusion. Just an outright illusion. That would have grabbed Kant's attention.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you certainly on your final point. I mean, I like that very much. Yes, Kant was smart enough to reconstruct the treatise from the inquiry. I mean, to a certain extent, I utterly agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I did mention the Hamann
Richard, just very briefly,
a little earlier on. So we
just a very brief answer, please.
Yes, I'm going to be brief. I mean, I did sort of very briefly mention Hamann's translation earlier on. I mean, I was making the point that, I mean, even though the treatise was not translated into German until 1790, 1792, that there were perhaps these little, one can identify places where Kant would have found fragments. So, you know, there is this Hamann's translation that appeared in a Königsberg journal in 1771. I think it's very likely that that Kant read it and knew that it was a translation of Hume. I'm fairly sure that the reference within the prolegomener's preface about Hume abandoning his ship on the bank of skepticism or something along those lines, I'm fairly sure that must be a reference specifically to that translation of Treatise 147. In terms of the influence that it could have had on Kant, however, I think that, you know, people, previous interpreters or some previous interpreters seem to think that there's something about this translation that, you know, really contains remarkable material that would have just blown Kant away and that he would not have found within the inquiry. But I think really there isn't anything particularly extraordinary about Treatise 147. And, you know, I think anything that's within Treatise 147, Kant could have easily reconstructed by reading the very closely reading Inquiry Section 7, Part 2, and Inquiry Section 12, Part 1. There's nothing really within it that isn't contained within the inquiry or simply can't be reconstructed from a knowledge of the inquiry. Although, having said that, I mean, what it is something that I think is particularly interesting is Kant's relationship with Hamann, the translator. I mean, we find, for instance, Hamann citing large chunks of the inquiry in letters to Kant in 1759. But of course, because they lived so close to each other, there isn't really record of a considerable correspondence. Of course, well, why would there be a correspondence? They literally talk to each other. So there is always this question that Hamann, of course, obviously, could read English very well. He was very interested in Hume.
Richard,
for the sake of time.
I think I said enough. Yeah.
So just 2 or 3 minutes to wash our hands or our faces or whatever you would like to wash. See you in 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks so very much for this super good talk.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. 3 minutes.
Ahmed, do you want to check the audio? We cannot hear you. I think you're muted.
Is the sound better now? Can everyone hear me?
No, it's not really good.
Okay, so let me try to join. Seems that something went wrong with my.
Oh, now it was better.
Try doing something. I hope.
No. Oh, you're trying to join.
Yes, I'm trying to
Okay. The audio is not good now, so let's see if it's better with the other device.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better.
Okay, very good. So I will leave the screen with this connection and then I will talk through my phone.
Okay, this is really much better. Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Much better.
Okay.
Yeah.
So please let me know whenever you want me to start. So yeah, we are waiting for Alessandro.
Sure. Yeah. So whenever Alessandro says, we can start again. So we'll wait for him because he is moderating.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, Alessandro, you're muted.
That's not good when you want to say something. Thanks for making me aware of that. Yeah. So in our last talk of these presentations and papers on Kant from the Department of Philosophy of the American University in Cairo, we have our esteemed colleague, Dr. Ahmed Abdelmegid, who will be moving to the third critique. Professor Abdelmegid has the huge advantage to be moving into post-Aristotelian developments of philosophies, on the one hand specializing very much in classical and post-classical Arabo-Islamic philosophy with a focus on modality. And on the other hand, he is also working on Kant and on Husserl, as we'll be seeing in reference to Kant in a few minutes. He is in the process of finalizing a very important monograph entitled Rethinking Al-Kindi's Epistemology, the systematization of early Islamic modal metaphysics, which is coming out with Routledge. And in this book, he will be presenting his understanding of the development of early Islamic theories of modality. But he's also contributed to political theory with, for example, an article in the European Journal of Political Theory entitled Reversing Schmidt, the Sovereign as a Rational Guardian and the Peculiarity of the Islamic State of Exception in Al-Juwayni's Dialectical Theology. Today, this evening, it's neither purely theoretical philosophy, nor is it practical philosophy. We're hearing his reflections on Kant's aesthetics, and the work that we are going to enjoy now is entitled The Ideal of God as a Reflective Ratio Essendi and Cognoscendi of Aesthetic Judgment, a new perspective on the relationship between aesthetic judgment, morality, and rational religion. The floor is yours, Tira.
Thank you so much, Professor Topa. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry about the sound, so I have to speak through my phone, but you can see me through this through the camera of my laptop. So I have an old HP. I call it the dinosaur. So so obviously its microphone is falling apart. So in this paper, I defend a new perspective on Kant's argument for the subjective ground of the universal validity of aesthetic judgment by demonstrating that the idea of God has to be posited as an essential condition and also an epistemic condition. So ratio cognoscendi and essendi of its constitution. And to make a long story short, I'm mainly concerned with the problematic relation between universal communicability and the principle of reflective judgment, which is purposiveness without a purpose, on the one hand, and how that must be, not can, but must be related to morality, given Kant's development of aesthetic judgment in the third critique, the critique of judgment. So I start first by justifying why I think there has to be a moral ground for purposiveness without a purpose, engaging with both with the two species of aesthetic judgment, the judgment of the beautiful and the judgment of the sublime. And then I will try to convince you very quickly, given Kant's presentation of the idea of God in the analytic of the critique of practical reason and in the prolegomena and the critique of pure reason, as to why the idea of God in particular serves that purpose. And through that, I try to respond to some of the concerns that were raised by Henry Allison, for instance, about the relationship between morality and particularly and aesthetic judgment, and also the relationship between the moral feeling and the aesthetic feeling to some extent, and the circularity argument that was made by many scholars as to which one precedes the other, the aesthetic pleasure or the universal communicability of aesthetic judgment. So without further ado, my argument focuses on the constitutive role the idea of God could arguably play in securing the aesthetic judgment's reflective principle of purposiveness without purpose. Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck. I start with examining the threefold relation between the principle of purposiveness without purpose, morality, and the constitution of the two species of aesthetic judgment, the beautiful and the sublime. I construct this threefold connection in light of the main function Kant assigns to reflective judgment to harmonize and more specifically demonstrate how the territory, Boden, of reason or the supersensible can have influence, as he tells us in the introduction to the third critique, Einfluss haben, on the domain Gebiet of the understanding or the sensible realm. Reverting to the analytic of the critique of practical reason and based on the preliminary analysis, of the principle of purposiveness without purpose, I then argue that only the idea of God can make the threefold connection possible. In the second part of the paper, I proceed to investigate the idea of God as presented in the Critique of Pure Reason, and more importantly, the Prolegomena. I show that Kant's account of the dialectical origin of the conception of the ideal of God as a noumenal ground of possibility is in harmony with its suggested use as a ratio essendi and cognoscendi of aesthetic judgment. In conclusion, I briefly discuss, if I get to it, how the suggested aesthetic use of the idea of God may shed new light on the role of rational religion in the scheme of Kant's critical project. I specifically focus on a number of passages in the religion within the boundaries of mere reason, responding in my discussion to Paul Geyer's claim in his 1990 article, Feeling and Freedom, Kant on Aesthetic and Morality, where Geyer essentially claims that the gap between the sensible and the supersensible is totally resolved, and hence it couldn't be seen as a ground for understanding the relationship between morality and aesthetics in Kant. The common moral ground of the sublime and the beautiful and the principle of purposiveness without purpose. The subjective ground of the claim of the aesthetic judgment of the beautiful to universal validity is different from that of the claim of the aesthetic judgment of the sublime to universal validity. The subjective ground of purposiveness of the judgment of the beautiful is a result of referring the sensible manifold aesthetically judged to the understanding, whereas the subjective ground of the purposiveness of the sublime is a result of referring the sensible manifold to reason. The judgment of the beautiful results from the free but lawful play between the imagination as it synthesizes the sensible manifold and the concepts of the understanding without subsuming the former under the latter. Otherwise, it will be a bestimmt judgment, of course, of experience. The judgment of the sublime results from the failure of the imagination in synthesizing and subsuming the sensible manifold under concepts and the ensuing symbolic reference it has to the ideas of reason. However, the claim of the two species of aesthetic reflective judgment to universal validity share a purposiveness in relation to the moral feeling, moralische Gefühl. Kant summarizes these opinions in the general remark on the exposition of aesthetic reflective judgment that concludes his discussion of the judgment of the beautiful and the sublime. If one draws, I'm quoting 267, the result from the exposition thus far of the two kinds of aesthetic judgments, the outcome would be the following brief explanation. That is, the beautiful which pleases in the mere judging, thus not by means of the sensation of sense in accordance with a concept of understanding. From this, it follows of itself that it must please without any interest. That is sublime, which pleases immediately through its resistance to the interest of sense. Both as explanations of aesthetically universally judging are related to subjective grounds, namely, on the one hand, of those of sensibility as its purpose on behalf of the contemplative understanding. On the other hand, in opposition to those as purposive for the ends of practical reason, and yet, this is a very interesting part, both united in the same subject are purposive in relation to the moral feeling. The beautiful prepares us to love something, even nature, without interest, the sublime to esteem it even contrary to our sensible interest. But how can this purposiveness in relation to the moral feeling be understood? I will start with reconstructing the relation between judgment of beauty and Kant's moral arguments, given that the subjective ground of purposiveness of the judgment of the sublime results from referring the sensible manifold to reason. The relationship between the subjective universality of aesthetic judgment morality and the reflective principle of purposiveness without a purpose will be easier to establish. The judgment of the beautiful expresses the state of mind, Stimmung, or Gemütsstimmung, okay, produced through the purposive representation of an object without purpose. This purposiveness allows the faculty of imagination to playfully demonstrate the conformity of the sensible intuitions to the concepts of the understanding without actually subsuming these intuitions under a concept. A pure feeling of pleasure arises as a result of the harmony established between the faculty of the imagination and that of the understanding. This feeling, Gefühl, or state of mind, is universally subjective. It's not objective because it's neither associated with a determinate judgment about an object of sensibility, nor with a moral judgment about the good. However, it is not subjective in the same way as an interest in an agreeable object is based on subjectively relative individual inclinations. The interest in the agreeable has a specific purpose, reflecting the interest of a specific subject in a specific object. The feeling associated with the agreeable is subjectively relative. The fact that the aesthetic judgment and the feeling associated with it arise due to the harmony between the subject's faculties makes it universally subjective and hence universally communicable. Kant insists in section 9 of the Analytic of the Beautiful that such universal communicability is the ground of such pleasure, while the free play of the understanding and imagination constitutes a state of mind associated with the judgment of a specific representation as beautiful. The quintessentially characterizing feature of this judgment is the capacity for universally communicating it. Kant writes in 217 to 18, thus it is the universal capacity for the communication of the state of mind in the given representation, which as a subjective condition of the judgment of taste must serve as its ground and have the pleasure in the object as a consequence. The subjective universal communicability of the kind of representation in a judgment of taste, since it is supposed to occur without presupposing a determinate concept, can be nothing other than the state of mind in the free play of the imagination and the understanding. For we are conscious that this subjective relation suited to cognition in general must be valid for everyone, consequently universally communicable, just as determinate condition is, which still always rests on that relation as its subjective condition. It is due to the recognition of the universal communicability of a particular state of mind, that beauty is predicated of a particular representation and the feeling with which it is associated. As indicated earlier, Kant attributes the constitution of the state of mind associated with representation of which the beautiful is predicated to the free but lawful play of the imagination of the understanding. But there are countless empirical concepts that could possibly set this play between these two faculties. There must be a solid foundation for such universal communicability. Hence, Kant gives an account of the archetypal form of the aesthetic judgment of the beautiful in section 17 on the ideal of beauty. Kant writes, the universal communicability of the sensation of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, and indeed one that occurs without concepts, the unanimity so far as possible of all times and peoples about this feeling in the representation of certain objects, although weak and hardly sufficient for conjecture, this is the empirical criteria of the derivation of taste. Hence, some products of taste are regarded as example, namely the ideal of the beauty. Kant calls this exemplary product of taste the ideal of beauty. Kant then defines the ideal as the representation of an individual being as adequate to an idea. An idea is defined following the scheme of the transcendental dialectic in the first critique as, strictly speaking, a concept of reason. The ideal of beauty must have a ground in reason. The ideal of beauty cannot be of an empirical object like a beautiful body or a beautiful flower. All these concepts, when presented as ends/purposes, will subjectively differ depending on the empirical spatiotemporal concept. None of them can serve as an ideal of the aesthetic judgment of beauty, and universal communicability as its ground. Thus, Kant concludes only that which has the end of its existence in itself, the human being, who determines his ends himself through reason, or where he must derive them from external perception, can nevertheless compare them to essential and universal ends, and in that case also aesthetically judge their agreement with them. This human being alone is capable of an ideal of beauty, just as the humanity in his person as intelligence is alone among all the objects in the world capable of the ideal of perfection. The human being is the only being capable of an ideal of the beauty because of its dual nature. On the one hand, the human being is transcendent, moral, or holy being, heilige Wesen, as Kant describes the human being in the Metaphysics of Morals, who only achieves her being as a positively free being by representing the maxim enacted by her own reason. Hence, the human being is an end in herself. On the other hand, the human being is also capable of relating external perception to her universal moral ends. In a similar vein, Kant describes aesthetic judgment in particular as a distinctively human judgment in the introduction to the Critique of Judgment. I would like to preliminarily indicate, as I will demonstrate below, that the moral essence is bound to play a more central role than the natural essence of the human being in harmonizing these two essences of the human. Without the moral essence, the state of mind produced by the lawful play of the imagination and the understanding and judge it as beautiful would not be possible in the first place. For this state of mind wouldn't be warranted any claim to universal communicability, whose ultimate ground is the moral essence that makes the human being an end in itself. It is precisely this universal communicability of aesthetics that underlies the humanity of the human being, for it is the expression of the harmonization of the sensible, which give those ends, and the sensible and the super-sensible realm of ideas that give those ends in a whole that is the human being. Without the moral essence, what is specifically human about the human being as a rational subject would be hardly possible. Turning to the critique of practical reason, I will explore how Kant's moral arguments may further clarify the constitution of the judgment of beauty. Kant explains in chapter 2 of the second critique that the main incentive for the will to follow the categorical imperative is the moral feeling. The moral feeling arises from the satisfaction the will achieves in as much as it realizes its own freedom in abiding by the law given to it by reason rather than being a heteronymous subject conditioned by empirical causes. Such moral feeling of respect is described by Kant as completely pure and having nothing to do with physical feelings. However, the nature of this feeling and how it can bridge the gap between the transcendence of the pure will and the fact that actions are manifested phenomenally according to the mechanical laws of nature are left unexplained. A point, by the way, referring to the relationship between Heidegger and Kant, Heidegger makes a big deal about in the lectures later published as the basic problems of phenomenology, and also in his Nietzsche lectures, where he tries to make sense of that connection and tries to defend in one of the few cases Kant against Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, with whom he usually sides against Kant, but this is a different story. Anyways, aesthetic experience provides a way out of this problem. Aesthetic consciousness and the feeling of pleasure associated with it provides a way in which the transcendent ideas of reason, which ground morality, can be seen to have influence on the sensations and thus show the harmony of the two domains that seemed completely dichotomous and rather irreconcilable. But there is a deeper conceptual relation between the aesthetic judgment of beauty and the moral feeling. The ground of aesthetic judgment is its universal communicability, as we have shown before. This universal moral essence shared by every human being qua a rational agent. Hence, it is always purposive in relation to the moral feeling. Conversely, the aesthetic judgment and the disinterested pleasure with which it is associated supplements the pure moral feeling. Aesthetic judgment expresses moral feeling phenomenally. The purposive relation between the aesthetic judgment of the sublime and the moral feeling is even clearer, as I already indicated before. For instance, Kant explains that the feeling feeling of pleasure associated with the mathematically sublime is a feeling of displeasure from the inadequacy of the imagination in the aesthetic estimation of magnitude for the estimation by means of reason, and the pleasure that is thereby aroused from the correspondence of this very judgment of the inadequacy of the greatest sensible faculty in comparison with ideas of reason, insofar as striving for them is nevertheless a law for us. Kant argues that the state of mind expressed by the judgment of the mathematically sublime is the result of the failure of the imagination to estimate the scale of the object experienced and represent an intuition spatially, represented as an intuition spatially and temporally. However, reason finds pleasure in such experience because it is the faculty of seeking the unconditioned condition of all condition, and is thus constantly striving for completion and perfection. The way the sublime manifests the perfection of the ideas of reason induces respect for these ideas. But these ideas constitute the essence and basis of morality. Hence, the feeling of the sublime gives a concrete expression of the moral feeling. For example, freedom is the causa noumena of the moral law, because the judgment of the sublime shows the way in which ideas of reason are free from the limited representations afforded by the imagination. The judgment of the sublime and the feeling associated with it gives an in concreto expression of the moral law and its noumenal cause. Thus, if the state of mind associated with the beautiful harmonizes the ideas of reason and their moral import with the phenomenal world by showing how the former can give purpose to the latter, the sublime achieves the same result by showing how the former can be represented purposively in the latter. The common ground of the sublime and the beautiful is therefore their purposiveness with regard to the ideas of reason and their practical moral use. The capacity of the judgments of the beautiful and the sublime to harmonize the transcendent realm of reason with the sensible phenomenal world of experience is essentially connected with the moral and practical use of the ideas of reason and the moral feeling. Kant summarizes the distinction between the sublime and the beautiful as follows. The aesthetic power of judgment in judging the beautiful relates the imagination in its free play to the understanding in order to agree with its concept in general without the determination of them. So in judging a thing to be sublime, the same faculty is related to reason in order to correspond subjectively with its ideas, though which is undetermined, i.e. in order to produce a disposition of the mind which is in conformity with them and compatible with that which the influence of determinate practical ideas on feeling would produce. However, the above investigation of the ideal of the beautiful shows that both judgments have to be connected with the practical use of reason, and thus the moral feeling. The emphasis that has hitherto been placed on the moral dimension of the ideas of reason doesn't mean that all aesthetic dimensions have a moral ground. They all have an orientation provided by the ideas of reason. The emphasis on the moral dimension is primarily due to the regulative practical use Kant assigns to the ideas of reason. It could thus be concluded that the main function of aesthetic judgment is essentially the harmonization of the moral laws with their ground in the transcendent ideas of reason with the phenomenal realm. I would like then to argue as to why the idea of God very quickly offers a substantiation of that claim, that the ideas that the claim that I have been pushing, that there has to be a moral ground or an ideal ground for both the judgment of the sublime and the judgment of the beautiful, and that ideal ground is allowing us or giving us a window into how we can understand a possible phenomenal manifestation of the moral feeling, which is rather ambiguous in Kant. And I will try to argue that the idea of God is particularly unique in providing that ground, that ideal ground, for a very important reason, is that it is the least determinate idea of all of the three ideas of reason. And hence it fulfills the conditions of the principle of purposiveness without purpose. In the preface to the second critique, Kant outlines the role of the idea of God and immortality in the practical use of reason. The idea of God and the ideas of God and immortality, however, are not conditions of the moral law, but only conditions of the necessary object of a will determined by this law, that is, of the mere practical use of our pure reason. Hence, with respect to those ideas, we cannot affirm that we cognize and have insight into, but they are nevertheless conditions of applying the morally determined will to its object given to it a priori. 5.256. The moral law is the sole determinant of the pure will and its autonomy. If any other object takes part in the determination of the will, this would lead to its heteronomy, as we all know. Though through this determination, the rational subject realizes its freedom positively rather than negatively, vis-a-vis the phenomenal realm where freedom is experienced negatively. But reason seeks the unconditioned condition of all conditions, aiming at the highest good, summum bonum, as its ultimate target. Hence, the rational subject makes two important postulates that are definitely not the determining ground of the moral law, but are necessary conditions for its application. Given that the moral law is determined exclusively with regards to its form and not its content, the rational subject, who in following the moral law thinks of herself nominally as a free agent, still cannot be satisfied with following such a law, would lead to the kingdom of ends. The action of any rational subject are manifested in the phenomenal world according to the rules of the understanding. Only through the postulate of the highest good as the object of pure practical reason is it possible to overcome the dichotomy between the supersensible constitution of the moral law and its actual phenomenal application. Hence, Kant writes, towards the end of his resolution of the antinomy of practical reason, it follows that in practical principles, a natural and necessary connection between the consciousness of morality and the expectation of a happiness proportion to it as its result can be thought as possible. That accordingly, the supreme good is morality, where happiness constitutes its second element, but in such a way that it's only the morally conditioned yet necessary result of the former. Only with this subordination is the highest good the whole object of pure practical reason, which must necessarily represent it as possible, since it commands us to contribute everything possible to its production. But the supersensible relation of things, but since the possibility of such a connection of the conditioned with its with that which it belongs wholly to the supersensible supersensible relation of things, and cannot be given in accordance with the laws of the sensible world, although the practical results of this idea, namely actions that aim at realizing the highest good, belong to the sensible world. We shall try to set forth the ground of that possibility. In other words, Kant realized that the highest good has to be postulated in order to, because the highest good as God, or the highest good as the ens originarium, is is a condition of both the supersensible world and the sensible world. So it can allow bridging that gap. The postulate of the highest good serves, among other functions, to overcome the dichotomy between the pure intelligibility of the moral law and the manifestation of its application in the phenomenal world. But the moral law itself is not determined by the pursuit of happiness, of course. For this would lead back to the problem of heteronomy of the will. Rather, happiness is subordinated to the highest good. Further, the highest good is a rational idea produced by practical reason that can have no bearing on the sensible world. Therefore, it requires further conditions for the possibility of considering the highest good as the ultimate object of the moral law. These conditions are essentially what Kant mentioned in the preface, namely, the postulates of the immortality of the soul and God. The postulate of the immortality of the soul is primarily required as a condition of the possibility of the highest good in order to ensure the complete conformity of the disposition and actions produced by the will according to the moral law, since no rational being is capable of such holiness or complete conformity of her or his will to the moral law at every moment of her existence. Endless progress towards reaching such aim must be postulated. This endless progress is possible upon the assumption of the immortality of the soul. Therefore, Kant argues that the postulate of the immortality of the soul essentially establishes the consciousness of the complete morality of the rational agent, which he needs to always will the highest good as her main objection, as his main object. It is thereby a postulate that is mainly required by practical reason, or more precisely by the subject, in as much as she is making a moral decision. The postulate of God responds to the problem of happiness, which is in turn connected with the problem of the dichotomy between the supersensible and the sensible, and how such dichotomous relation constitutes a problem in explaining the possibility of the former having an influence on the latter in the third critique. Kant explains this dichotomy as follows. Happiness is a state of the rational being in the world, in the whole of whose existence everything goes according to his wish and will, and rests therefore on the harmony of nature with his whole end, as well as with the essential determining ground of his will. Now, the moral law, as a law of freedom, commands through determining grounds that are to be quite independent of nature and of its harmony with our faculty of desire. The acting rational being in the world is, however, not also the cause of the world and of nature itself. Consequently, there is not the least ground in the moral law for a necessary connection between the morality and the proportionate happiness of a being belonging to the world as part of it, and hence dependent upon it. For that reason, cannot by his will be a cause of this nature, and as far as happiness is concerned, cannot by his own powers make it harmonize thoroughly with his practical principles. The moral law is determined on pure intelligible grounds according to the universalizability principle. In order for the rational agent to recognize his or her actions fulfilling the moral law, she must be assured that the moral law is their cause actually, Wirklichkeit, in actuality. However, these actions, being phenomena like any other phenomena, are given to her according to the necessary laws of nature based on the senses of intuitions and concepts. Therefore, the rational subject can never be assured that her actions are actually in conformity with the moral law, and hence cannot attain happiness. Happiness, as the quote above illustrates, consists in finding harmony between the will and the actions and existence in the world. Happiness is inextricably connected not only with the harmonization of the supersensible and sensible realms, but with the capacity of the former to have an influence on the latter. This problem, which occupies a considerable part of Kant's discussion after the analytic of pure practical reason, is essentially the same one with which he wrestles in the first introduction to the third critique, the critique of judgment. In order to overcome this problem, Kant argues that the existence of a supreme being must be postulated. the postulation of the existence of a supreme being that is the cause of nature by understanding and will assures the rational subject of the harmony between the moral law, the ground of the determination of the will, and the phenomenal manifestation of the will in the realm of nature according to the rules of the understanding. If the ultimate author of nature, nature being the representation of phenomena in accordance with the laws of the understanding, is also an intelligent rational being, then the moral laws determined in a pure intelligible manner must be in conformity with the structure of the phenomenal world. Thus, the postulation of the existence of God justifies making the pursuit of the highest good the object of the pure will, and that such pursuit will lead to the attainment of happiness. For even if this happiness is not attained in this world, it can still be hoped for in the hereafter. The relevance of the moral use of the idea of God to the structure of aesthetic judgment is now clear. Of all the ideas of reason involved in the constitution of the moral law, through the practical application of reason, the idea of God is the one that plays the essential role in harmonizing the purely intelligible moral law determined solely in the supersensible world with the necessary structure of the phenomenal world wherein the actions of the rational subject are manifested. As I indicated, Kant argues that there are three main ideas postulated in pure practical reason: the postulate of freedom, the postulate of the immortality of the soul, and the postulate of God. The postulate of freedom is realized through the autonomous determination of the will, which in turn is based on its pure intelligible determination. It cannot therefore serve as the guiding principle for the imagination in its purposive harmonization of the supersensible with the sensible. The postulate of immortality is connected with the rational subject's consciousness of her capacity to be endlessly in conformity with the moral law. In contrast with both ideas, the idea of God is postulated essentially to reconcile the pure intelligibility of the moral law with nature, and hence to show not only that they are in harmony with each other, but also that the former can influence the latter. Further, being the ground for happiness, which is an integral part of taking the highest good as the object of the will, the idea of God gives a possibility for manifesting the moral feeling of respect, which lies at the core of the choice to make the will in conformity with the moral law. Therefore, the idea of God turns out to be the most suitable idea for guiding imagination in its harmonization of the supersensible with the sensible. For the idea of God is the idea that essentially constitutes the possibility of the harmony between the two realms. Therefore, it can give the orientation required by the aesthetic imagination to interpret nature purposively according to moral ends furnished by reason. It is noteworthy to mention that this peculiar role of the idea of God could possibly respond to the criticism often addressed to Kant's postulates.
2 or 3 minutes, please. 2 or 3 minutes.
I'm sorry?
Left. 2 or 3 minutes left, please.
Okay, so I'll skip that part. But to continue supporting my claim that the idea of God is the idea that can give this orientation to aesthetic judgment, and both of its pieces, as Kant argues in section 59, God as a symbol of morality. I would quote very quickly section 55 of the Prolegomena, where Kant characterizes the transcendental ideal in a very interesting way. He says the third transcendental ideal, which affords material for the most important, but if pursued only speculatively, transcendent and thereby dialectical use of reason, is the ideal of pure reason. Reason in this case does not, as with the psychological and cosmological ideas, start from experience and err by exaggerating its grounds in striving to attain, if possible. I strongly disagree with Ellington's translation of it as exaggerating, because the original in German is Steigerung, which is extrapolation or extension. Okay, so the psychological idea is the extension or the amplification of the subjective grounds, and the cosmological is the amplification of the grounds of the phenomenon. Hence the idea of the self and the idea of the world. But the idea of God is different. Kant says rather it totally breaks with experience and form, and from mere concepts of what constitutes absolute completeness of a thing in general. Hence, by means of the idea of a most perfect primal being, proceeds to determine the possibility and therefore actuality of all other things. In other words, the idea of God as a thing, and this is why I wanted to continue the critique of pure reason, is least determinant of all ideas, and I argue for that in the section of this paper engaging with the critique of pure reason about the idea of God defined in the transcendental dialectic as the ultimate thing in itself and the principle of thorough determination of things. Okay. So it serves like that because it's the least determinant, and what gives determination is experience and actuality, infinite experience. So to wrap up things, since I understand I'm totally out of time, very quickly, I am arguing essentially that the idea of God, given its least determinate nature, fulfills the principle of purposiveness without a purpose. And if that is the case, and if I have succeeded in showing that both the aesthetic judgment of beauty and that of the sublime require an orientation from the ideas of reason, then it would be God that does that. And that in and of itself, from my humble perspective, as I would like to argue in further research, allows us to understand many of the statements that Kant makes in the religion within the boundaries of mere reason, as to the importance of the postulate of God to civic life on the one hand, but also in the fascinating and posthumously published lectures, 1817, as far as I remember, they were published, the lectures on the philosophical doctrine of religion, where he argues about the importance of the idea of God to historical occurrence. And that, I think, can solve some of the mystery that Heidegger was wrestling with in that Nietzsche, in that very short piece in the Nietzsche lecture, where he talks about aesthetic and history, but he doesn't see how it can happen, or he doesn't explain. I shouldn't say that. Okay, it allows historical occurrence, but if you bring the idea of God in that technical aesthetic use that I'm suggesting, it can explain a lot about the relationship between religion and history and aesthetic judgment. I'll shut up now. I'm very sorry for taking too much time, sir.
Yeah, I don't know. Thank you very much, dear Ahmed. I'm sorry to function as the clock, as I've been saying before. Thanks for this talk that brings aesthetic judgment definitely into perspectives which are not often tried out. Let me put it like that. Let me see what the audience has in terms of questions. I don't know whether Rodica or Georgia was first, so let me say that Rodica starts first.
I was the first one.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Ahmed, could you stop sharing the screen?
Oh, sure.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Rodica, go ahead.
No problem. My problem is to explain me shortly what is the difference between the ideal of God and the purposiveness without purpose of the aesthetic judgment. One. The second, if there is a difference between happiness and the reception of the beautiful. I think maybe the idea of completeness of what in this way there is another connection with the theoretical philosophy. aside religious and moral connection of the judgment, excuse me, of Kant's aesthetics with those fields. These two questions. So shortly, the connection between the ideal of God and the purposiveness without purpose, and after that, the relationship between between the reception of the beautiful and happiness.
Okay, thank you very much for these two very good and excellent questions. So the first one was I was arguing that the idea of God provides, if I am right in arguing that both the aesthetic judgment of beauty and the aesthetic judgment of the sublime. So we have to make that we have to grant that argument first, which I think that there is a lot of support for that they are both need a ground in practical reason. And if the so in the super sensible or the realm of the ideas, and if the idea of God is the least determinate idea, then it is the one most qualified to guide, to give purpose without purpose. Why? Because if we take the idea of the self or the world, and this is why I quoted that section 55 from the Prolegomena. They have a certain element of determinateness in them. They are the extensions of the two components of experience, and it is experience that gives determinacy through the synthesis of concepts and intuitive content in Kant. So infinite experience. So this is the connection I'm trying to draw between why the idea of God can serve in directing or orienting the purposiveness without purpose of the aesthetic judgment with its two species, that of the sublime and that of the beautiful. So this is the first part of the question, of your question. The second part of your question, you mentioned the connection between between happiness and what? I'm sorry.
The beautiful, the reception of beautiful.
Oh yes. So that what I was trying to argue. Thank you very much. I'm sorry because you mentioned something as well, something about theoretical reasons. So I got confused a little bit.
Introduce the idea of completeness, which is a theoretical one. Vollständigkeit.
Okay. So the reason why I brought happiness into the conversation here is that happiness has to do with not with the constitution of the moral law, but rather the feeling, okay, the moralische Gefühl, okay, of fulfillment that following the moral law really has an effect on the world. And this is a problem in Kant, that the moral law is purely intelligibly defined, but once you do the action according to the moral law, it becomes a phenomenon in the world, and hence it's constructed according to at least as and perceived according to the laws of the understanding. So the connection there is how as I was indicating in the first section of the paper, how the moral feeling, how the aesthetic feeling of pleasure that is associated with universal communicability of the aesthetic judgment allows for a concrete way of understanding the moral feeling in a particular way, and hence can allow as well for the super sensible to influence the sensible. and hence satisfy that gap, and that which needs to be bridged in order for happiness to be granted. That would be between, yes.
Yes, I see.
Yeah, good.
It's okay.
So I think we have made some progress. I'm not sure whether Radhika's voice was only unclear for me or also for the others, but I think that with the answer that you Ahmed, have kindly given, this has become something like a unity of its own. So let us proceed.
Approximately. So
approximately, yeah. As I said, not everything
the
came through
speaker
clearly.
answer what he believes to be the answer, to be spoken. But
Yes.
well, anyway,
it's
okay.
It was a dialogue. It was a dialogue with a strong component of imagination. Let me put it like that. So, Georgia, your question, please. I think you have to unmute yourself. That's normally my specialty, not to do that.
It's always. Thank you. Thank you, Ahmed. Hi, everybody. I agree with Ahmed with the fact that moral judgment or communicability grounded in a super sensible ground. But I think that we must pay attention. If Kant don't speak of God, there must be a reason, I think. When he speaks about a super sensible ground in common between human and nature, without speak of God, I think that is important, because the perspective of the third critique that is a little bit changed from the first critique. He think about the problem of systematicity, of unity, and we can think that these three Regel, these three the principle, teleological principle, are no more matter of reason, but matter of reflective judgment. It's an important change, I think. That's why from the argumentative way, I think it's not correct to justify what happened in the third critique, go to the first, because I think Kant think about the problem of unity and give another kind of solution in the third critique. And this kind of solution don't imply necessarily the idea of God to justify a unity and systematicity and morality too. That is my perspective. I agree. We have always a metaphysical ground, but the indeterminate way in that Kant describes, or not describe better, this super sensible ground. I think it's significant in the sense of there is no, we don't need to have an idea of God to justify the beauty. That is my perspective. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very insightful comment. To a great extent, I agree with you. I'm not. Let me clarify. First of all, I was not trying to go to. I agree with you totally that something totally different happens in the third critique. So, and in that sense, I usually disagree with many esteemed Kantians who always try to understand everything. The three critiques in terms of only the structure of the first critique, but I didn't get to that part in my paper, unfortunately. But the reason why the part that I invoke in Kant's characterization of the transcendental ideal in the first critique mainly has to do with the indeterminacy of the idea of God. So it's not that I'm trying to I understand that people might think that I'm trying to push the idea of God in an exaggerated way, but this is not really what I'm trying to say. That if there is a metaphysical, super sensible idea that is going to guide that, it must be the idea that is least, that will guide the orientation of the imagination in harmonizing the super sensible with the sensible, which is problems that Kant starts with his discussion in the third critique. Then that idea has to have certain characteristics. One of those characteristics is that it should be least determined, and this is what the quote from the Prolegomena shows about the ideal of God. The other one, the characterization also of the ideal of reason, of God as the ideal of reason in the transcendental dialectic, also supports that. Okay, that it doesn't have any determinacy. Determinacy is essentially defined negatively vis-a-vis the idea of God, because it includes everything. It is a ground. So it's and I am also arguing that if that is the case, then we can understand why God comes a lot in his concerns about history, and his concerns about the relationship between philosophy of religion and civic life, and in the religion within the boundaries of mere reason. So I hope that responds to your question. So I'm in total agreement with you that we shouldn't look for the grounds of the third critique in the first critique. I was just, if I had got to that section, I was just focusing on the indeterminacy of the idea of God, and how that is in harmony with purposiveness without purpose as a guiding principle for the aesthetic job.
Great, thank you. Professor Westphal, please.
Thank you very much. Acutely aware of the time issue. My questions, which I don't expect you to answer off the top of your head, into the chat. Everyone can see it, but I'm very intrigued by what you're pulling together, and I just thought it might be worth considering what might be the relevance to aesthetic judgments and their universality, and to your account today of the autonomy of rational judgment per se, right, as such, also regarding sensory and empirical matters, whether we're talking about empirical knowledge or we're talking about aesthetic phenomena and our enjoyments of it. And in this connection, I just thought I'd ask you whether you think Kant's universalization tests, using either the categorical imperative or the universal principle of Recht, are reflecting judgments, and that they include reflecting upon our own judging, and thus our own basis for considering or making any specific judgment.
Okay, so very quickly, I will have to ask you about the second part of the question again to make better sense of it. But in connection with the first part or the first question, thank you again for taking me back to the place where I started with universal communicability. I mean, people can rightly criticize what I said about the idea of God as a ratio cognoscendi and say that, well, doesn't the harmony come from the harmony on the epistemic level with the faculties of our of the understanding, and that's it. And but it is precisely the issue of the problem of communicability is where morality and it's among its postulate, the postulate of God. And I made an argument very briefly in my talk as to why the postulate of God, apart from the postulate of the immortality of the soul and the purity of the will, has to be that one that guides that principle, is necessary for communicability. Because if as Kant tells us, aesthetic judgment is the foundation of sensus communis and hence cultural meaning, I don't think it's enough, and please feel to disagree with me, to communicate or to build a culture and have a common sense simply based on harmony, the harmony with the harmony between objects and our and the faculties of our the faculty of our understanding. There must be something beyond that, and that expresses our ends, as I tried to argue in the ideal of beauty, and hence, okay, a purpose that we all share, and that allows us to see our morality as influencing the world, the physical world that we are living in, okay, and assures us that our positive freedom, okay, is having a real influence beyond the negative way in which we experience our freedom, as he explains it in the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, and this is why he starts with positive freedom in the Critique of Practical Reason. So you are absolutely right. Universal communicability is, if it is one of the quintessentially characterizing features of aesthetic judgment, then there must be a moral ground that allows that communicability beyond the simple epistemic harmony between the intuitions and the faculty of the understanding, at least in the case of the beautiful, the aesthetic judgment of beauty. As far as your second, did I touch on your question properly?
Yes, let me just interject a little postscript to both, and about the cognitive and about the sensus communis. Kant agrees with Aristotle. We are at zoon politikon. Right? He's quite clear about this in many places, but especially in the educational writings. None of us become cognizant beings without an awful lot of social assistance, familial and village and all the way up. So it's not that individual human cognition can dispense with those social and ergo moral aspects of who in the hell and what in the hell we are. Right?
Okay.
Now, I'll leave it there only to suggest I don't think I ascribe rational autonomy to the likes of Trump.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel a bit bound by the role that I have, but I will be self-disciplined and not say anything. So let me rather invite the other attendees, whether there are still remarks that they would like to make or questions that they would like to raise. Farhad.
I just want to add as a follow-up that when Kant speaks of the idea of common sense, there is no reference to morality there, and you seem to be inserting God there. So he's talking about subjective necessity, the modality of aesthetic judgment, the fourth moment, and he's saying we should just presuppose the idea of common sense for the communicability, and that's all. Stop. Period. And the idea of common sense would provide the ground for communicability up to that point. And there is no reference to the ideal of God or any reference to morality at that point about communicability. So communicability is self-explained through the idea of common sense, according to Kant in that section.
Almost.
Well, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if I didn't insert the idea of God. My argument was if aesthetic judgment, okay, is going to be universally communicable and hence serve as a foundation for common sense or for sensus communis, okay, then, and this is the argument that I was trying to show, based on the structure of aesthetic judgment, it has to have a ground in reason, okay? And which idea of reason can serve that ground? I argued it would be the idea of God. So it's a multi-layered argument. So you are right. At the very beginning, he just says it. It's an assumption. But the question is, how can we explain it as sensus communis, as the foundation of common sense? I think this requires an explanation, because aesthetic judgment, if it is going to be the basis of common sense, okay, it has to have a ground of universal communicability. And I think that ground of universal communicability is driven from the orientation that the ideas of reason give to aesthetic imagination, and in constructing the two species of aesthetic judgment, whether it is the sublime or the beautiful. And I was arguing that the idea of God is the one that does that. My impression, if I understood you correctly, is that you wanted to leave it as an assumption and not to try to explain it further, or that trying to explain it further would insert the assumption that Kant doesn't want. Did I get your question correctly, or?
That's Kant's exact wording. We have to presuppose the idea of common sense in order to explain universal communicability. It's not the conceptual communication, but it's this idea of common sense that we have to presuppose to explain the necessity, the subjective necessity of aesthetic judgment.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, I will. If am I allowed to make one last comment? If I. Okay, in response. In that case, then we will get into. I think this is a problem that Allison raised about the circularity here of the argument, okay, and he raised it in his book on Kant's theory of taste. Which one assumes the other? Okay, is it the universal communicability, or, and this is where this is why discussing the feeling of pleasure and connecting it with that universal communicability is important. Because it's the assumption there seems to go in a circular way. Is it universally communicable because it's common, or the other way around? And the same holds with the feeling of pleasure. And what I was trying to put forward
that's clear. That has become very clear. I think that we have brought in view a number of things. Your position and your account has become now very clear, thanks to Farhad's reference to the text, what is originally there. I think this might develop into an interesting discourse in the future. I'm giving the command that I have back into the hand of Karim and of Luis. Thank you very much for having us. And we have to finish, I fear, yes. Aesthetic pleasure is limited.
Okay, so thank you so much, Alessandro. And well, I think the Kant Society in Egypt is off to a great start. And I hope that the next sessions of the society will be as good and stimulating as this one. And thank you so much, Edison, for putting this together. Thank you, Alessandro, for moderating it. And thank you, Edison, Richard, and Ahmed for the great talks. It was a little bit longer than usual, but I think it's also fine given the symbolism that we have in your Kant Society. So that's great. I've just posted on the chat the schedule. So in 15 days, in about 2 weeks, we have the next session that will be curated by the Norwegian Kant Society on the Kantian foundations of democracy. So you're all warmly invited to join. And thank you so much, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.